Russia says it's appointed a new general to lead its Ukraine offensive after suffering a series of military setbacks. The country's defense ministry has named General Sergei Surovikin for the role. Moscow's army then facing some criticism in recent weeks, particularly levelled at its leadership. Well, for more on this story, Frank Ledwidge is a former military intelligence officer. He's equally a senior lecturer in strategy at Portsmouth University. Frank, thanks very much for speaking to France 24 today. We've been hearing about this lightning counter-offensive by Ukrainian troops as they attempt to regain back territory that was lost to Russian troops. Is this blast on a bridge today part of that strategy in some way?
Good afternoon, Rochelle. Yes, absolutely. The Kerch Bridge represents what's called in military terms an MSR main supply route for the Kherson front. About 15,000 vehicles cross it every day, 36,000 tons of all kinds of supplies. It'll be very difficult for the Russians to offset that. Now, the way they'll do that is, well, there is one lane, I think, still open on the bridge, but anyway, that won't do the trick. No, what they're going to have to do now is use the road from Taganrog in mainland Russia across the Mariupol corridor, so that through Melitopol towards Kherson in South Ukraine. What that means is that they'll be under fire from Ukrainian artillery. So it's a very significant blow, both to Crimea, but especially to the Russian troops in Kherson, who will now be wondering how their supplies, such as they will be getting to them.
Ukrainian responsibility for this. There's been no actual claim as such. Is that part of military tactics? Are these operations carried out and then nobody claims responsibility, or is it too obvious?
We all know who did it. There's credible leaks coming out of Kiev now that the SBU, which is the Ukrainian intelligence service, both internal and external, was responsible for this. They're not quite boasting about it, but they're not denying it, let's say. At the state level, presidential level, you're not going to hear any admissions, although this clearly was a Ukrainian attack. Don't forget it's Putin's birthday. Any attacks on Russian territory in the past have been met quite with some ambiguity. We've had attacks in Belgrade, but don't forget this is an attack outside Ukrainian territory now, and this is certainly a step on the escalatory ladder, and we can expect a response from Russia, maybe not today, but certainly in the not too distant future, and that may well take place. It'll be severe, and it may well take place outside Ukraine's borders. We'll see. This has been an attack on Russian critical infrastructure, so it's significant in that alone.
I mean, coinciding with this, of course, is Russia appointing this new general to kind of lead its Ukraine offensive, of course, after suffering a series of setbacks. How much does that speak to the issues that are being reported that Russia's having on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, those that follow Kremlinology have been pointing out that what Putin's seeking to do here is identify scapegoat should the entire operation collapse. We're into the third iteration now of Russian senior commanders, and we've lost a dozen or so other generals. They've lost another dozen or so senior generals. Really, this is simply another way of redirecting blame, of bringing to the fore somebody who might be in the picture should everything go wrong. By the way, this particular general is tipped to take over the top job, if he can cope with this one, from General Gerasimov, who's the chief of the Russian General Staff, the command of all Russian armed forces. He's a very capable individual, as indeed are many Russian generals. The trouble is they're involved in an operation that cannot succeed conventionally at the moment, in any rate.
I mean, if we come back to today's blast on this, as you say, very strategic, very important bridge, particularly for Russia, can we expect a response from Vladimir Putin or indeed from his troops around today's situation?
Yes, Rochelle, absolutely. As I indicated earlier, this is an attack on Russia, from the Russians' perspective, on Russian territory. Not only that, on Russian critical national infrastructure. Last week we saw the Nord Stream pipeline attacked, probably again by Russia. We don't really know that, but it's a fair assumption. And it would be my analysis there that what that was, amongst other things, was a display of intent and capability in the energy sector, but also the intent and capability to take operations within this conflict outside Ukraine's borders. So we need to watch out for that, and certainly Western armed forces are very cognizant of that risk. So yes, we will see a response. What that will be, obviously, we don't know, but it may well be something that may affect people outside Ukraine.
I mean, staying with this idea of a possible response from Russia, I'd like to get a sense from you, words that were uttered by President Joe Biden yesterday when he spoke about, an Armageddon and the fact that, Vladimir Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons should be taken incredibly seriously. That's been echoed by Zelensky in the last day or so. What are your thoughts on whether Russia is prepared to use nuclear arms? There are those who say that we're nowhere near at that stage, but others are saying, it could come to pass.
Well, my analysis, for what it's worth, is that that's at the end of the escalatory road we're now on. There are plenty of steps before then, not least those I've already outlined. Outside Ukraine's borders, perhaps even chemical attack or in the cyber domain or even in space before we get to nuclear. We have to remember that I think it's fair to say that NATO and the US will ensure that if there's any kind of nuclear display, or let alone a nuclear attack, which would be militarily useless for the Russians, by the way, the response will be that it will be overwhelming, be the loss of the Russian Air Force or the sinking of the entire Black Sea fleet. There are a couple of options that have been put forward. Be extremely damaging for Russia, not only at the battlefield level, but also the political level as well. And needless to say, a strategic step change. And Putin, if nothing else, is concerned with the survival, like other despots like him, like Kim Jong-il and so forth, ultimately with the survival of his regime and the survival, most of all, of himself. That'd be seriously compromised and put at huge risk were he to take that step now or at any time. So we're not there yet. We're nowhere near it, I suspect, but we will see some form of escalatory step from Russia over the next few days.
I mean, just very briefly, because we are running out of time, Frank, is President Biden, for you, at this stage in the game, exaggerating when he talks about Armageddon?
I think it's worth saying that President Biden has been involved in this world for the last 50 years. He's pointing out the end stage risks that have been studied for decades. He's fully familiar with those. We are not looking at that yet.
All right, Frank Ledwidge, you're a former military intelligence officer and senior lecturer at Portsmouth University. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us this Saturday afternoon.
Thank you, Rochelle.
Well, officials in Ukraine